Today's daf is daf Ayin Tes. We are going to begin at the top line by the Mishnah. The Mishnah. Hoisa imedes al rish hagag uzrokei lo. If the woman was standing on top of the roof, and her husband was standing below, and he threw the get to her. She's on the roof, and he threw the get to her. So the halacha is kiven shegel aver hagag. Once the get comes to the ear space of the roof, harizei migresha, she is considered divorced. Now, hu milmaila v'hi milmata, if he was above on the roof and she was below on the bottom, uzrakalai, and now he threw her a get. So the halacha is kiven sheyatzim reshus hagag. Once it leaves the area of the roof, nimchak ein yisref, if it was either erased or burnt, harizei migresha, she is divorced. So now the Gemara asks, v'holei minter, but the ear space is not secured, which means since the get can be blown away from the roof by the wind, it should be considered as a chatzar, which is not mishtamenes, which we know is not kaina. So why is she divorced once the get reaches the ear space of the roof? The chair is not a chatzar mishtamenes. We're talking about that the roof has like a type of parapet, which is considered a chatzar mishtamenes, so the get won't be blown away, and it's considered a good get. Ulam bar Menashe mishmeda avimi, Omar Ula bar Menashe says in the name of Avimi, a different answer. And here we're talking about that the roof is 3 tvachim to the other roof. That anything within 3 tvachim of the roof is considered like the roof itself, based on the principle of that the two solid surfaces are connected. Even if there's a gap, they're connected because it's less than 3 tvachim. So it's like it landed in the same area. In regards to whom milmailo, if he was above and she was below, and she threw a get and he threw a get to her, so once it leaves the area of the roof, she is divorced. But the airspace of the chatzar where it's being thrown is not secured. We're talking about where the lower partitions in the courtyard extend beyond the upper partitions of the roof, so that the get will certainly fall in the courtyard. We're talking about where the lower partitions extend beyond the upper partitions. We're talking about where the lower partitions extend beyond the upper partitions. So Abba says to Ula Keman, in accordance with whose opinion is the halacha that once the get enters the woman's domain, it's considered as if it was given to her, even though it was destroyed before it landed onto the ground. So where it says Keman, this is like the famous sheet of Rabbi Amar, who says Kluta in regards to Shabbos. If let's say one throws a object from a Rishus Harabim to Rishus Rabin, Rishus Yachid Be'emsa, so the halacha is that you're chayav. Why? Because Kluta Kemi Shehuncha, because the airspace is considered at rest, which means that any item in the airspace of a domain is considered to be placed within the domain. So therefore, once the woman, even though it was destroyed before it landed, we say Kluta K'mishuncha, it's like it landed. Amar Lei, now Ula says, Afilu Temen Rabbanan, you can say even this is Shittas Rabbanan, Ad Kan Lepik Rabbanan, that Rebbe and Chacham only argue in Shabbos in regards to Shabbos if you say Kluta K'mishuncha or not. But in our case, Mishum Inteirihu, because the get is secured, that she's divorced. Well, and in this case, it's secured while within the airspace of the mechitzas. We're talking about where the lower partitions in the chatzar extend beyond the upper partitions of the roof. So Rav Zera says to Rav Asi, Keman, who is this? So Rav Asi said to him, you could even say this is Shittas Rabbanan, that they only disagree with Rabbi Yehuda in regards to Shabbos. But over here, because the get is secured, and in this case it is secured while within the airspace of the partitions. It was taught in the Mishnah that once the get leaves the domain of the roof, so nimchak, even if it was erased before it reached her hand, she's divorced. It has to be erased when it was already on its descent entering her domain. But if it was erased while it was on ascent, in other words, as it arched upwards before it fell, it will not work. My time, what's the reason? Because initially, before it began to descend, the get is not destined to land in her domain since it could be blown elsewhere. So we can't say that it's already resting in her domain. Nisraf, if it was burned, So this works only when the throwing of the get, a divorce preceded the fire. But if the fire preceded the throwing of the get, it will not work. My time was the reason because initially because it was heading towards being burnt. Domains are divided with regards to Gittin. If there are several areas within the domain, for example, a house, a chutzner, or a gag, they are not all considered a single domain. With regards to divorces, rather, each one is considered to be a separate domain. So he asks them, from where do you know this halacha? He says, Mastizani, it's our Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? If the woman was standing on top of the roof and her husband threw the get to her from below, once the get reaches the airspace of the roof, she's the divorce. So the Gemara says, what are we dealing with? If we're dealing with a case of her roof and her courtyard, so why do I require the airspace of the roof in order for her to be divorced? Even if the get remained in her chutzner, she'd be divorced since it's her chutzner. So the answer is rather you have to say that it's his roof and his courtyard. So once the get reaches the airspace of the roof, what is it? Why is she divorced if the get has not left his domain? So rather, you have to touch up the Mishnah that talking about her roof and his courtyard. So now, Amos Sefer Rava says, look at the Sefer. If he was above on the roof and she was below, and he threw it, once it leaves Rosh Now, and if we're dealing with a case with her roof and his courtyard, so why is she divorced? Rather, it was necessary to say that we're dealing with a case with his roof and her courtyard. Now, Rava asks, is it possible to say that the first case of the Mishnah is dealing with a case of her roof and his courtyard, and the later case is Sefer Begag Didei V'Chatz Didah, a case with his roof and her courtyard? How the same Mishnah discuss two halachas where each one is dealing with a different reality without mentioning the distinction? Rather, we have to say that the case is that the roof and the courtyard belong to him, but he lent her the place. And Chad Makam Meshli Inshi, people lend only one place, as we had the Svar already once in the Gemara. Today, Mekim is the Mishnah, they do not lend two places. Rav Chizda understood that one can be mashma from this Mishnah that the chutz and the roof remain as a separate domain, and concludes that with regards to Gittin, different areas in one domain are considered to be multiple domains. So Amalei, he tells him, Ram Bar Chama tells it to Rava, midi area, are these cases comparable? Dilma Hakadisa Hakadisa. Maybe the first case of the clause in the Mishnah is dealing with the case of her roof. And maybe the later case is dealing with the case of his roof and her courtyard. Rava says, there are three halachas, three unique qualities in regards to Gittin as compared to the halachas of Shabbos. Number one, Hadam Rabbi, we said that Kluta Gmishuncha, we said that Rabbi holds a Kluta and the Chacham argue, and Hanimil in Shabbos. This is in regards to Shabbos. But in regards to the case of the get, it's secure that she is divorced. And once the get is within the airspace of the partition, it's secured, and the Chacham agree that she is divorced. Now, the second case is Chizda says that in the case of one who stuck a reed in the ground of Rosh Hashanah, and on top of it was a basket, and he threw an object from Rosh Hashanah and rested upon it, even if it's higher than Mea Amma, Chayiv is Chayiv. Why? Because Rosh Hashanah goes to Rakia. In regards to Shabbos, but here in the case of the get, it's because it's secure that she's divorced, and it's not secured. And the third thing is the person should not stand on his roof and collect rainwater from the roof of another if there's no joining chotzer. And the reason is that just as residents are separated below, so too the residents are separated above. Each residence has a separate domain, and it's usher, we know, to transfer an item from one rishus to another rishus if they're not joined. Similarly, despite the fact that the roofs are not totally separated from one another and nobody lives there, each roof is considered to be on its own. So he says, Rav explains, in Shabbos. This is in regards to Shabbos, Gittin, and you get. In regards to get, this is due to the fact that the husband is particular and does not want to lend her more than one place. But people are not particular to that extent. In other words, in this case, the husband will not be particular about allowing her to temporarily use an adjacent rooftop also belonging to him. If there are two courtyards that are configured such that this courtyard is within that courtyard, and the inner courtyard is hers, and the outer courtyard is his. And the partitions of the outer courtyard extend higher than the partitions of the inner courtyard. And he threw her a get. Once it reaches the airspace of the partitions of the outer, our Zumagash is considered Magadashas. When it says my time, what's the reason? Pneumius Gufa, the inner courtyard itself is secured by the partitions. Coming into and the outer and the inner courtyard itself is secured by the partitions of the outer courtyard. The Gemara says this is not so with regards to the baskets. In the case of when you have two baskets, this one within that one, the inner basket is hers and the outer basket is his. And he threw it. Even if it comes to the Avar Pnimius, and in Megarashish she's not Megarashish. Why? My time. What's the reason? Because the get did not rest within the basket, and in this case, the walls of the outer baskets do not service the inner basket. And even if it would rest, it doesn't change the facts. They're like the vessels of a buyer in the domain of the seller. Since her basket is within his basket, which is his domain, she cannot acquire the get despite the fact that it's her basket since it's within his reshus. So my answer is this: we're talking about we're talking about shulayim with a basket that has no bottom, and the inner basket is resting on the ground and not inside the outer basket. Therefore, once the get lands inside the inner basket, she is indeed divorced. So the Mishnah say that a man may send a divorce his wife with an outdated get, and Basil says it's usher. The Mishnah what is considered a outdated get? Where he was secluded with her after he wrote the get. If the Gemara they are arguing, Beishamai holds that we do not say that the get is invalid midrabanan as exeter, that maybe we'll say that people will say that the get preceded the conception of her son. In other words, if he gives her a get long after it was written with the same date, since she may give birth to children from him in the interim, people will say, oh, the child came after the get was written. No. We do say and we do say it. Amar of Abba Amar Shmuel. If she doesn't get married, she doesn't have to get divorced. Other people say Amar of Abba Amar Shmuel, and his garsh if they get divorced, they know so the Chatchila she can get married the Chatchila. There's no requirement for her to wait for her husband to write her a new